to go ahead? Yeah, I think we can go ahead and kick it off, Willa, just for the sake of time, if you want to get started.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Good evening. I'm Willow Williford with Williford LLC, and Mary's just connecting now. So I'm a housing consultant based in Crested Butte and have been working now with Peter and Shannon and other members of the community through the needs assessment process, and was last in front of you back in November, sharing those findings. And now tonight have the pleasure of being here to share our nearly final action plan, but get your feedback on this draft that we see as almost complete. And so we have just a few slides to summarize the document that was in your packet, and then we'll devote most of your study session to whatever discussion you would like to have. So I would invite Mary to introduce herself, and then we also have Augustina from our team helping us take some notes and track the changes that might arise.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mary Coddington. I work with Willa and have been excited to get to work with you all and get to know your community through this needs assessment and action planning process over the last few months. I work for Capelli Consulting. We are an affordable housing consulting firm based in Denver, but we do a lot of work around the state, specifically with this kind of strategy work.
Augustina, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Sorry about that. My name is Augustina Remedios, and I am also part of Capelli Consulting. I helped a little bit more with the formatting of this plan, but happy to be here and just support Mary and Willa as they give you this presentation. Thank you.
So, by way of telling the story of how we got to where we are today a little bit more, we kicked off the housing action plan in the new year after we kind of all digested the information of the needs assessment. And the steering committee that had helped inform the needs assessment and link us with many of the key resources we needed in terms of understanding your local housing market, then continued their work to guide the strategies that we're putting forward in this document, as well as the goals. So that group had a kickoff meeting in January. A little bit of an echo. We then did a pretty in-depth site visit with an employer housing workshop in early March. And we also did some specific work on the Woodbury site through this conceptual design workshop that Barry will talk a bit more about. And then worked with the land use heirs group that you've been, your other consultant team has sort of aligned and overlapping work on housing to ensure that we were kind of all pointed in the same direction there. And out of that comes this draft action plan in front of you. And what I think we could ask of you tonight is for your guidance on the draft, and then when the document is final, it could come back to you as a decision point for adoption. So obviously a study session, you're not making any decisions, but you can certainly give us feedback, guidance, direction, and we can make sure that the plan is right on track for what you need in your community. So just as a reminder that the needs assessment found there was a need for about 75 additional homes in the Craig area, and that was skewed a little bit more towards for sale. But if we just think about sort of the composition of how many people rent and how many people own in the community now. But we also heard a very urgent need for rentals especially from employers, and the challenges that they're having in terms of recruiting and retaining qualified people. And having housing inventory at the price points people need. So we did Also identify some gaps around the specific price points that are needed in your market and the size of the units and this overwhelming desire for new quality construction, just because there hasn't been a lot of residential construction in the last 20 years. So when we got together with the housing working group and talked about the findings of the needs assessment and started to transition our thinking towards what do we want to do about this need, and recognizing that the level of permits that have been pulled in recent years has not nearly kept up with the housing demand, and that some interventions and partnerships from the city and other government agencies and nonprofits and so forth are needed to sort of activate the housing development in your community. The housing working group felt like we should really be bold here and try to address somewhere between 75 and 100% of the identified need. And there's even some concern that the need may be sort of growing as we speak. So through that conversation, we landed on a target of 90% of the need. And then we further broke that down as some ranges of for sale units and for rent units. We also wanted to make sure that this is realistic and achievable, even though we know it's pressing forward in a way that is trying to do more housing than we've been doing in the past. And we looked out over about a 5-year time frame because that's what we found is sort of an effective amount of looking into the future. Beyond that, our ability to project and to implement actions gets a lot more hazy. But we think that if you make a concerted effort on housing and you can achieve these goals in the next 5 years. So we further broke down the city's the priorities around housing that came out of the needs assessment and how we align that with city support. And I think this has been a really important part of the document through our conversations with Peter and Shannon since the very early scoping of the project of, every time a developer approaches the city, they want kind of the sun, the moon, and the stars to help them make their project feasible. And the city has obviously very constrained resources. You want to make housing happen, but you want to make the right housing happen and use those resources really strategically. So and I need to advance my slides here. So this slide really helps then say, if you're doing these types of housing, here's all the ways the city can partner with you. And if you're doing, these other things, well, yes, we still think that that new housing is important to our community, but we may not bring sort of every tool in our toolbox to support that. So this is a place where I think, I would invite the council to pay kind of close attention, and we can tweak and refine this if we haven't quite hit the mark right in your opinions as the ones leading policy discussions and negotiations. So we will now transition to the 5 priority strategies, and I will let Mary take it from here, and I'll be back with you for the wrap up and questions.
Thanks, Willa. So the 5 priority strategies that were identified are leveraging city-owned land, coordinating a really supply-focused employer approach, which is a little bit different than just employer-assisted housing. Implement a housing investment fund, zone for affordability, and craft annexation policies that result in a public benefit. So we'll talk in a little bit more detail about each one of these. So the first one is leveraging city-owned land. So one of the most important elements of getting a development done is making sure that you have a place to put it that makes sense. I'm catching up to myself on the echo. And so the city actually has quite a few parcels that they own. And one of the ways that we looked at this sort of as a bridge between doing the housing needs assessment and the action plan was to do a development feasibility analysis. So we looked at several different parcels throughout the city, some that are city owned, some outside of that, to understand what some priority sites might be. City ownership is definitely one of the pieces of the puzzle that gives sites a high ranking, because then you guys can decide what you want to do with that and how that fits into your overall goals for housing for the community. Other factors consider zoning, available infrastructure and topography, different pieces like that in terms of how we look at sites that might be a good opportunity. One of the top sites, actually the top site that came up through that process was the Woodbury site. And so we did a little bit deeper dive into that to look at the sort of housing that might make sense there. So the way that we did that was through a housing concept workshop where city staff and other stakeholders in the community got together to walk the site to sort of understand the constraints and how it related to the neighborhood context. And then we met back at City Hall to talk through, some different design options that could work on the site. And this was the most popular option from that group. Now, obviously, this is very much just a concept plan. And I'll say at the beginning, one of the most important next steps is to hold a wider community engagement. But in this concept plan for the site, there is the potential for a small apartment building on the corner there that could potentially be done using low-income housing tax credits, along with 14 units that are sort of duplex style development with 14 accessory dwelling units behind them, and then 12 additional duplexes sort of along the southeast perimeter of the site there. And the group talked a lot about their goals for the site, even before we got into sort of figuring out the orientation and potential uses that might make sense. Some of the things that they called out that would be really important is that it look and feel inviting, that there be a diversity of housing types and price points, that it's compatible with the existing neighborhood, and that the development is something that the community is proud of, that could potentially serve teachers, medical professionals, city staff, or others. So this particular concept would have 70 units on the site. So there's a lot of potential there. But the other next steps, in addition to the wider community engagement, also include creating a land disposition plan. Right now, to dispose of city-owned land, it's basically goes to the highest bidder. And if you're really looking for community serving housing with this diversity of price points, some ways of revisiting that are rephrasing that in the code so that you can donate or sell the land if it's meeting community goals, or you can put the land into a long-term lease so that affordable and community serving housing can be developed on it. Additionally, the site would need to be rezoned, and there are some different approaches to that we'll talk about a little bit later when we talk about zoning for affordability. On this particular site, one of the ideas that we floated was having two zone districts here, one that's a little bit denser along the perimeter, and then as you move closer to the neighborhood, zoning have a lower intensity, and so not just zone it all as the same thing. And then put out a request for proposals for developers that would be interested in partnering with the city on this opportunity. The second strategy is to coordinate a supply-focused employer approach. And as we talked through this strategy, we actually met with local employers in the workshop that Willa mentioned at the beginning. And the good news is the employers in the community are super interested in being a part of the housing solution. Through the employer survey that we did as part of the housing needs assessment, over 80% identified housing as somewhere between a moderate and critical problem in Craig. And I feel like everybody's really motivated to figure out, what their piece of the puzzle is. So key strategies within this that can actually increase the supply potentially is to have employers use their own surplus land as potential development opportunities, creating more housing in the community. Additionally, leveraging master leasing can just be a general employer assistance strategy for housing, but it can also help increase the supply because it can potentially provide security for new developments. If they know that they're going to be able to be leased up in advance, they can get more favorable loan terms and help with the financing piece, knowing that they're already leased essentially. And then the third was creative partnerships. And this came out of having the Yampa Valley Electric Association at our employer meeting and talking about, potentially being able to trade some of their infrastructure services to have units that were dedicated to their employees. So figuring out these partnerships where, different employers can bring things to the table in exchange to help support their housing need directly. The third strategy that we looked into has actually changed since you got your packets. In your packets and in the report, this is listed as aligning infrastructure with your housing goals. But in talking with staff after we issued that draft version, this strategy is actually a little bit bigger than that, and it has to do with the housing investment fund that was going to fund the infrastructure, and looking at that as a more holistic tool. And so right now, this fund is seeded with American Rescue Plan dollars and the congressionally directed spending specifically for those infrastructure expenses. And the city partnering with developers who are working towards specific housing goals is a great way to use those funds. But some additional uses that can come out of a housing investment fund that will be really important in the future are land banking opportunities, and then potentially direct grants towards developers that are meeting those goals. A key thing here, and this kind of goes back to the chart that Willis showed with the different housing priorities and different things the city would offer. You want to make sure that there's sort of rules of the road and that the allocations correspond to the housing needs identified for Craig. One other thing to consider with a housing investment fund, to maintain longevity here, some of the money can be structured as grant funding. Additionally, some of it can be structured as a revolving loan to continue that fund as long as possible. And then it's also probably a good idea, especially because there is so much interest in the housing issue right now, to look for different options to replenish the fund going forward. And there are a lot of different opportunities for that, including just a regular sales tax, which I know is always politically challenging. But also at the state legislature, they just opened up the opportunity to use local lodging taxes to go into housing funds, whereas before they could only be used as part of the marketing district. The fourth recommendation is to zone for affordability. So we mentioned this briefly in relationship to the Woodbury site, but this is a really important way to signal to developers what you're looking for, and also attract developers, specifically those looking to do a project with low-income housing tax credits. If they have an area where they're able to do that as a use by right and don't have to go through a lengthy entitlement process, they'll be more attracted to it. So overall, zoning for affordability, there are a few different ways to get there. One is to just revisit the zoning map and figure out maybe if the zoning boundaries could be changed to have more areas allow duplexes and triplexes and apartments and those kinds of pieces. The city could also leverage planned unit developments more and have these overlay districts that sort of supersede the underlying zoning. And there would need to be a few tweaks to that, potentially reducing the size of the development that qualifies, and maybe changing the open space requirements. So that's a little bit more useful of a tool, or it could be implemented more, although there are pros and cons to that. And then the third approach would be just to conduct a full code audit and look at all of the different ways that you can change your regulatory environment to be more favorable to affordable housing. So this can be done by reducing dimensional standards. This can be done by adjusting sort of the use by rights in different zone districts, and just figure out ways that it reduces the expense to build. And then the last of our 5 priority strategies would be crafting annexation policies for public benefit. So right now in Craig, it's a very discretionary environment, what's required for an annexation, but a lot of communities are starting to call out the things that they want to see from developers in exchange for annexation. So looking at the creation of community housing or other local priorities that would be a benefit to the city by sort of opening up that opportunity to developers. So I'm going to pass it off to Willa to talk about the proposed timeline for these different strategies, and then look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mary. So, we have laid out the 5 strategies on this 5-year timeline, which then, and it's always tempting as we're very excited working on action plans to just start everything now. But I think that as we looked at, the momentum and the capacity in the community and what things we felt like really we should focus our efforts on and get some traction on before we add more to our plate. It seemed that leveraging the town-owned land and proceeding with a development process, rezone and development process on the Woodbury site, and the supply-focused employer strategies should be the first things to kind of come right out of the gate following this plan, if that's the will of council. And that then the work on the housing investment fund, zoning for affordability, and that annexation piece could be something on the work plan next year. And those projects may not be as time consuming or resource intensive necessarily, and might fit in well once you have some traction on the other two. So this is very open to, obviously policymakers and budgeting priorities and, shifting, but this laid out some initial recommendations based on the feedback we received from the community and our assessment of sort of the capacity and what timing we think things could proceed on. So sorry, I meant to just speak a little bit more on that slide about what happens next from here. So we gather your feedback this evening, and then we will incorporate a few of those changes that Mary mentioned regarding how we're sort of broadening the strategy that had been about aligning infrastructure and really talking about it more as a housing investment fund that can do a number of things that can be beneficial to making housing feasible. So that, that can include land banking, that can include supporting the types of projects where you might want to see something proceed and it just has a gap between what it costs to build and what local wages can afford, and the city could play a role in making that financially feasible. So we'll incorporate those changes, any other changes that come up tonight, and then we anticipate that the final document will be ready around May 10th or 11th. And so then we would look to Shannon and Peter to bring it back to you for adoption. So yeah, tonight is really the opportunity for you to make changes large and small. We very much appreciate your time with the document and the feedback that you've provided a lot throughout this process. And we'd open it up for discussion. And I have a few questions for you if we're slow to have people jump in a general discussion. But I'll start there since.
Hi, Willow. My name's Sean Avorka. I'm one of the newer council members, so a lot of this was done before my time on the council. One of my biggest questions is probably going to be around timing. With 2027, this is going to be right when some significant job changes, income changes are going to be occurring in Craig. I'm kind of understanding that a lot of this was probably based off of potentially median income on the houses that we're going to be looking at. Along with that, I would anticipate that when some of these mining and power plant jobs are lost, that a lot of homes are going to be going on the market. So I guess two-sided question here. What happens when the median income in Craig declines significantly? And also what happens when we potentially flood the market with houses going on, with all of the coal miners and power plant operators putting their houses on the market and also adding these 70 units that we're talking about here?
Great question, and that was very central in the conversations around the projections, because you're right, you have this dynamic of declining job projections, yet a lot of work happening in the community to try to do around economic development and what are the new jobs that might replace that. So a few key things I would just observe is that in our conversations with realtors and property managers, they noted that a lot of the adjustments related to the closure of the mine and coal plant would be around have already occurred, so that the people who have been foreseeing that, they actually saw that really impact the market when those closures were first announced, and that they are seeing now just tremendous demand, and a lot of that from tourism economy and spillover from steamboat and so forth. So I think that we also said in the needs assessment, let's take this slowly and continue to assess, because you have a very much a chicken and an egg relationship with your housing supply and your ability to do the economic development that you're trying to do around new industries and new jobs. So, in our conversations with employers and with Shannon, it was very clear that the first question any business that's considering relocating to Craig is asking is, what's your housing inventory? What are the opportunities there for my employees to be able to find a comfortable home? And so, they're seeing this plan tries to, or the needs assessment and the plan both try to sort of walk that fine line of being realistic about the demographics, and yet also appreciating that there's a lot of hard work at play to chart the future in a way that's going to be constructive. So I would not recommend bringing 70 units on all at once. Yet I think the 70 unit goal is aligned with the data.
Thank you.
Well, Chris Nichols, City Council member. I'm looking at your Woodbury financial modeling, and your hard costs and hard and soft costs come to $350 a square foot. Are you seeing these as realistic costs right now with construction material, inflation, where it's at, or are we even higher?
Yeah, so they are. The other thing to take into account, if you are just looking at the hard cost number, is there isn't currently a separate line item in for parking. So that's a real just sort of catch-all number right now. Those are reflective of what we have been seeing, although in our modeling going forward, I think the interest rate overall in terms of borrowing there is 4.8%. And I think we're a little bit higher now on that number, which will probably soften materials costs slightly. But at this point, I don't see a big jump in terms of the overall cost.
Thank you.
Yeah, so certainly, we are doing our best to use real-time data from other communities. And it is an exceptionally volatile construction market, as I'm sure you're aware. So yeah, if you have feedback on that, either, higher or lower, Mary's been running the models and trying to keep them up to date, but they do change really quickly in these current times.
It's Councilman Avorka again. Looking at your rough model, I know, like you said, that's a very rough model. Just one thing that I would definitely encourage to consider when we're developing these any further, one of the major topics of conversation has been walkability and snow removal. So those are, I'm sure that you guys discussed those at length in your discussions with the city. Just definitely keep those at the front of your mind. I know we did have that. I saw the one path that was over there towards the baseball diamond, but if we put something in that doesn't have walkability in it, there might be 7 new councilmen looking for positions somewhere else.
That's music to our ears.
So that we can have that in front of us. And yes, that was very much a conversation where we were on the site of, how, if we're showing the property line ending here, but how do you then connect this neighborhood to a potential bus stop, the baseball diamond amenities, the existing neighborhoods, and make this, really a place where people can move around really comfortably on foot. Do other council members have comments or questions?
This is Paul James, councilman. So when you talk about rezoning for lower income housing, is that going to be, is the intention there to have that housing be federally subsidized?
So when we were talking through this site, one of the big priorities was a diversity of income. And so the way that we modeled it was having some of the duplexes be for sale. And then we were thinking that the apartment building there could potentially leverage the low income housing tax credits, which would be coming, we modeled it with the 9% coming from the state. And then just to touch on income levels there in the building, it would average at 60% of the area median income, but could go up as high as 80% of the area median income.
And Councilmember James, I took your question a little bit differently around overall, our recommendations around zoning for affordability relate to just, do not relate to subsidies. They relate to creating an environment that is conducive to the kinds of housing that are more attainable without subsidy necessarily. With regard to this site, as Mary was saying, you know, we think that if you were able to attract some state and federal subsidies that go into the upfront construction of the building, and then commit to long-term rents, there wouldn't be an ongoing subsidy kind of in the old style of like public housing or Section 8, but it would help you get that building built. And then it would operate, you know, for the local community without a subsidy ongoing. There will likely be a pretty significant financial gap between what it costs to build these little duplexes and the recommended price point we have for your essential workers. So this is sort of an inherent challenge in housing across the state right now, as we're talking about those high construction costs. And we did not identify a specific subsidy that would make that up. So that could be from Peter's Housing Investment Fund. It could be seeking outside resources from foundations or other grantors or the Division of Local Affairs, et cetera. Or working with groups, you know, that specialize in building below market rate housing, be it through Modular Factory or Habitat for Humanity and so forth. So there's a myriad of different strategies that could be brought to bear. And we certainly heard loud and clear from the community that there was a desire for a broad range of household incomes and sort of stages of life that people are in. So we need to tailor that in the next phase of, you know, making a concept like this real.
And one other thing I'll say to that, especially, you know, to Willa's point that the recommendations around zoning aren't specifically targeted at subsidized affordability. When we were doing the development feasibility analysis, the top 5 sites that sort of rose to the top as being the most viable, 4 of them were not zoned for the type of housing that I think would make the most sense there. So just really looking at the opportunities for development and making sure that the underlying zoning is supportive of that.
Thank you.
Willa, this is Derek Duran, and a council member, and was a part of the steering committee. And I appreciate everything you guys have done. We're kind of hitting on the affordable housing and the low income and trying to fund that gap. What's the strategy for you know, larger than 2-bedroom, 1-bath houses where community members potentially might want to upgrade in the future? You know, we're kind of set on this 2-bedroom, 1-bath, and then these rental properties. Is there any plan for any larger development?
Yeah, I mean, Mary can maybe speak to this as well, but in the development feasibility work, you certainly have several large sites that with annexation potential that have had a lot of conversation around more traditional single family subdivision style development. The big challenge there right now is that I think that is very much, you know, when we go out and ask people in the community what their dream home is, where they want to live, it's kind of in that style. But between the cost to extend infrastructure and the cost to build, you know, the actual home, we're really out of step with what local wage earners can afford. So if we're looking at, bringing a house online for $600,000 or $700,000, and north of that, it kind of gets right to the heart of why the market hasn't been effectively providing that for you lately. So I guess I've described the problem more than the strategy, because we were more focused on the more immediate needs of your community members and the employees that your employers are trying to attract, which is needing to focus well below the $500,000 mark.
Yeah, and I think that there'll still be a gap between the areas that are focused on through the strategies in this report, although things like zoning for affordability is a pretty broad-based strategy that supports all types of housing development. But for this work, we were, in terms of sort of the homeownership piece, even we're looking at smaller homes that could serve as starter homes, but also downsizing opportunities for the senior community in Craig. But to your point, I still think that there's a valley there in between, increasing the number of starter homes or homes available to downsize, and then the $600,000 homes that the market's providing.
I think, it's another opportunity that we saw with the needs assessment is, appreciating that if there are a lot of homes that are sort of underoccupied, if you will. It's like a single person living in a larger home. And if they had a place to move to, that they would desire to move to something smaller and with lower maintenance and free up that home. And so one of the things in our recommendations is really trying to create that movement within your market. And it's interesting to layer in then, if people who are leaving the area as the job composition changes, if there's a way to preserve their homes for the next local hospital employee or what have you, as opposed to someone who's not working in the community. Now that gets a little micromanagey in terms of the market, but it is something that is a consideration if you want to focus some resources on that space around that move up home. Other questions, comments? I'd love to get some feedback on how people feel about the overall goal, if that feels about right or too low, too high. We had a pretty lively discussion about this at the employer focus group where some people were saying like, that's not nearly enough housing. And others were saying, yeah, but it's quite a bit more than we've been doing. So let's start here. So I'm curious if that feels like it's in that happy middle ground, or feels either too ambitious or not ambitious enough.
I think it's reasonable. I actually like the overall plan for the most part as well, which is weird for me, but I think this is pretty good, and I think that we need to probably get to work on this pretty quickly.
How do others feel?
I mean, as long as we're kind of accounting for that oversaturation of the market potential, then I think it's reasonable. Just depends on what we decide our future is going to be. So.
Well, I think, like I said at the employer workshop, the more the better. I think it's what's happening in a few years is huge, but I do see just huge demand coming from Up Valley, and the need for housing is amazing. I understand more than 2,000 people a day are leaving our county to go work en route, and I think it's also it's something that needs to be taken. That could go up another 1,000 easily, and quite quickly, and so I think that's why that we need to be aggressive here.
This is Chris Nichols again. Interesting, Tom mentioned the down valley fluctuation. Did you account in your numbers trying to work with Routt County and move down valley housing for some of the people from Steamboat to Hayden, even to Craig?
Yeah, it's, so we did have, within the needs assessment, so I'll answer that question in two parts, because within the needs assessment, we had this metric around people who currently commute into Craig for their work and would like to live in Craig. We took our job as being about housing people who live and who work in Craig and are part of the Craig community. And we know there's tremendous, part of why that isn't functioning is because there is all this pressure from the Steamboat market. We had a lot of conversations around Brown Ranch, which is such a big unknown. And I am on the consultant team for that project. So I'm quite familiar with the challenges and the opportunities of that site. And then we are also working in Hayden on their needs assessment and action plan. So we see each of these communities as really trying to tackle their housing problems and taking quite a proactive posture. And we did not inflate these numbers to say Craig would take a larger role ongoing. But you're absolutely correct that if that pressure continues to mount from Steamboat, if we update this in 5 years, we may find your housing problems quite a lot worse.
You don't know anybody with $25 million donations like Brown's Ranch, yeah?
No, but I know Mr. Peasley at Yampa Valley has been, eager to support and participate in solutions up in your neck of the woods. So hopefully those conversations can continue and he can introduce you to some of his well-off friends. Others, did we kind of get a litmus test from everyone on sort of, is the goal about right? Are we on the right track? Another question I might ask, are there just any strategies that really feel off key for you for Craig? Like, that you question our ability as a community to implement?
Well, do you mind going back to the slide that has the 5 strategies listed so we can look at those?
Good idea. And if there aren't further council comments or questions, we're happy to give you a little time back before the rest of your meeting. And we would also always welcome you to provide, if you have further thoughts over the next week or two, provide those to Peter and Shannon, and we can, consider them as we do our final revisions.
Can you give me more detail on what the craft annexation policies for public benefit?
Yeah, happy to jump in on that. So on this policy, and also in the report, you guys may have seen, we sort of assessed each policy in terms of the difficulty to implement and whether it's a long-term or short-term impact that you're going to see here. So we're seeing this come up in a lot of different communities around the state where developers are really interested in annexing the parcels that they have that are near the city to obviously access all of the benefits that come with being incorporated, residents being able to vote in municipal elections, all of those pieces. But instead of having sort of a one-off decision-making process on what each annexation is going to look like, some jurisdictions are codifying in their zoning code and development code the things they want as a city if they're going to make that choice to bring more land in. And so really just clarifying that if you have a developer who wants an annexation to happen as part of their development, and some cities go so far as to specifying, we want 20% of the housing to be affordable, and can get really detailed with it. But I think even just clarifying that there are some expectations that community housing will be part of that development if the city makes that choice, will be helpful in knowing what kinds of proposals developers should be bringing if they're looking at asking for an annexation. So this is a policy that is definitely geared more towards the longer term, but is also not incredibly hard to enact quickly.
Tom Kleinschmidt, City Councilman also. Just, you did mention just very shortly, short-term rentals in your report. And just given what's happening across the state, it seems like this particular item is exploding, and it may be something that we need to consider a little bit more in our deliberations as we go forward. Even in Steamboat, it's their city council almost grapples with it every meeting. But it may be something that we can do some proactive things about beginning to license these kinds of things, or even look at them, because they do take away from people's ability to rent a house or be able to find housing in some places. But I think that what's different about what the Craig market is, we've had about 100 hotel rooms come off the market this year and go into this temporary housing. And I would say it's very temporary. I wouldn't want to live there for much of my career, but it may be a stopgap. But because those are off the market, and the amount of festivals and things we have seem to be building in our community, there's talking to hotel owners right now, they're full. They're not going to be able to accommodate the balloon festival and the Whittle the Wood and have much room for that, because they're already booked. So I see a great opportunity for some people getting into short-term rentals, but I also think it's been tough on people investing in that in some resort communities, and those investments have been hit pretty hard with, we're going to reduce the number of short-term rentals, or we're going to change the rules. And I think as long as we got a clean slate, this might be an opportunity to get this done and have an action plan.
Yeah, I love that you're bringing that up, and sort of taking a proactive approach, I think is the best thing that you can do. We are seeing this, as you mentioned, as a huge pain point in other communities across the state, and it's really hard to sort of right-size the approach around it. I think short-term rentals can be really beneficial if moderated, and also, connected to now that they've changed the state legislation. If you do decide to license your short-term rentals, you can also have lodging tax from those go in to support other housing efforts in the community. So definitely encourage you all taking that up.
Yeah, and I would just add to what Mary said on this one, because it is, like you say, it's kind of wildfire ripping through many of our communities, and we had, and it's really a struggle if you're putting all this work and effort into attracting new housing to your community and you're just losing inventory to short-term rentals as you go. So the opportunity to put some rules of the road into place before you're at a point where members of the community feel like too much short-term rentals has happened, is really good. So, if this feels like something you want to elevate into, we had just put it as kind of a thing to keep in mind, as opposed to like a thing you're going to start working on at a certain time. But we could certainly add that if that was the will of the council, because I think there's a lot of wisdom to that. And, finding that number, whether it's 10 or 20%, of your housing inventory that you'd be okay with having short-term rental licenses on, and also, collecting, doing that licensing process so that those are safe and attractive to the people who come, I think it has benefits both on the tourism side and on the community housing side.
And I would echo that. There are some very positive things that can happen with short-term rentals. And I think I just think if there was a businessman getting into that line of work, that they would want to, or that investment, that they would want to have some guardrails set up so they know what they're investing in. So I agree with you that it is a bridge that will help us with probably a lot of new lodging is not going to be built in our community in the short run, but short-term rentals might help us quite a bit.
Willa, this is Peter. I was talking to a friend of yours today, Ben Doyle. Do you know Ben?
I most certainly do.
Okay.
I'm a big Ben Doyle fan.
We were talking about housing authorities and what the benefit of that has been to communities like Rifle and Delta with a mission to expand housing in their communities. We don't necessarily have a housing authority that has that mission currently, but we talked about special limited liability properties and the tax credit benefits that a housing authority can bring to the table. Can you talk a little bit about how you think that should proceed, maybe for the city of Craig?
Well, I'll just share, that I'm an unabashed housing authority fan. I think that we have in Colorado the ability to create this entity that deals specifically with the problem of the housing the community needs that the market isn't providing is awesome. And any community that's facing that problem should use their housing authority, should create a housing authority or use their housing authority to the best of their abilities. So I was disappointed that the Moffat County Housing Authority is very narrow in their scope around, just serving seniors. But I think that, so a couple things there. I think that organizations can evolve. So as the housing needs in Craig become more, there may have been a time when just serving seniors was the right focus for them. But as your needs evolve, maybe that organization could evolve to help meet them with you. The other opportunity there is to invite a neighboring housing authority to help you, which I think you've already done some around Yampa Valley. The specifics, housing authorities have many, sort of, I don't want to call them secret powers because they're well known, they're codified in state statute, but they have these powers and authorities that are helpful. And particularly the one you're referring to, Peter, is that if a housing authority has a sliver interest in a residential property, that property becomes exempt from sales and use and property tax. So it can be extremely beneficial if you're trying to build a $15 million building. The savings on the sales and use tax of the construction materials is significant, and then the ongoing operating benefit of that tax exemption also has a significant benefit. So it can make you more competitive in bringing in other resources. It can make the numbers work. A lot of private sector developers will approach a housing authority and try to hammer out a deal around them having a sliver interest. The other thing I really like about that sliver interest is then it provides some long-term stewardship, because if the original developer of the property only wants to be in the deal for 5 or 10 or 15 years, the housing authority is already there in the documents at the table, potentially able to take on the long-term ownership and management of that. So I think I'm bullish on housing authorities. I would love to see yours grow and evolve to be more involved in the solutions you're trying to implement.
Housing authorities are more geared towards below AMI housing, is that correct?
No, I would say maybe traditionally, and maybe that's the way we think about them, but certainly across the mountain communities of Colorado, housing authorities are serving up to 200% of area median income and beyond. So really, they're defined in statute as addressing housing needs that are not met by your market. So in the needs assessment you have, we could tailor the work of a housing authority to say these are the needs that aren't being met by the market. We just documented them. Housing authorities are also able to participate in market rate real estate. And I know some housing authorities that they'll own a big market rate building and they'll use that income to help subsidize other work in their mission. Now, I think is not always as good a fit because, well, why are you doing that? Like the private sector could be doing that, but it is certainly permissible within the way that they are structured.
And some of those mountain communities have a unique problem where they have super high property values with a pretty low AMI compared to pretty much you have absentee summer or winter homes or summer homes that are high value with a working class that makes substantially less than that. I mean, so
yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the most vexing of housing problems in some ways, but certainly, we could look to examples like Gunnison or Alamosa or Montrose, where like maybe a housing authority is working in a space that's more in the middle income than the traditional low income dynamic.
So, I mean, with the overall proposal, I think, 75 seems like a reasonable number of units that Craig needs. I mean, I can think of at least about 10 openings right now that are above AMI paying jobs where if they were hired right now, that's great, but they have nowhere to live. The hotels, I know of agencies that have hired people right now and they can't even get people into hotels because the hotels are full. So literally you could hire somebody, but there is nowhere for them to live right now at all, right? And that's super problematic. So I mean, the quicker we can start putting rooftops up, I understand there is a probability that 150 houses may go on the market if a bunch of jobs are lost. But I also see that every time we hire somebody, or someone leaves us, they go to another existing position that's already in the area. It vacates one position because that person either retired and moved out, and that's been happening at a higher rate, I think, in the last year, where people are either early retiring or moving out of particular industries and getting into other stuff. I've had friends that went into the nursing field, out of the coal mines. They're starting to do that move. People moved out of state, going to Texas that used to work at the power plant. So I think there's a lot of that movement going on that opened up a bunch of homes, and I thought they were going to stay vacant, and next thing you know, there's a shortage because the minute a house hits the market, it seems to be selling fairly quick.
That is a conundrum I've noticed with the workforce over the past 10 years. We've lost hundreds of high-paid jobs in that 10-year period, and yet we don't have any houses on the market.
Right, which is weird.
And as soon as we build houses, they're going to roll out of substandard housing, and that substandard housing is going to get fixed up. And we're going to see that rotation, which is necessary for our housing market here locally.
I do think there's a lot of people that are living in a rental right now who haven't moved into the market because there's nothing on the market that's appealable. I mean, there's just nothing for them to go into. So they're hoping for a new build, and you can't afford to build right now by yourself without some type of housing development coming in.
We heard that very much from the realtors and property managers of like they almost laugh when someone calls, asking for a certain profile of what they want and can afford, because yeah, it's a very frustrating situation if you're trying to move from renting to ownership.
I think there's a lot of them out there that it's just a point of uncertainty at this point too. Are they sure that they want to buy a house on a 30-year note in a community that they're not positive is what their direction is?
Yeah, I mean, we still have some large employers like the school district, the hospital, potentially the college in the future. Another industry that might show up that could bring some stuff in, but there again, all four of those potential employers have the same problem. There's no homes.
Right.
Do we have any idea of the age demographic of people that work at the mines? I mean, within the next 8 years, obviously, a lot of those people will be probably set up for retirement, which some of those people will still move. A lot of them, I believe, still will probably stay here if they have family here or anything. And I was just curious if I think that age demographic's probably gotten older than it was 20 years ago when there was a lot of young people there, that if the mines and plants would have closed then, I think there would have been a lot of people having to hightail it because they've been out looking for jobs. I don't know what the demographic is for the people.
The average age of trapper is probably 50, 55, but here in 7-8 years, yeah, they'll be, that's the problem, is they're going to be borderline close to that.
Yeah. So
there's
some
gonna
of,
be a lot of people that are gonna need 4 or 5 more years.
I was just curious what that age group
I
was
would
gonna
say
look
50,
like,
55 trapper right now.
As I say, a lot of people won't want to leave if they've built a life here, even if they have to retire a little earlier, but I don't know what that number looks like. If they're not looking for a job, there'd be no reason for them to leave unless they just want to, but there's going to be some in that midlife that going to be needing to find a decent job still,
Well, I just wanted to honor that we're at 6 o'clock. We thank you so much for the feedback and comments on the document, and look forward to connecting with Peter and Shannon on the final changes, informed by tonight's discussion, and then they'll be bringing the document back to you at a future meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you, Willa.
Thanks, Willa. Thanks, Mary.
You all. Good night.
Thank you so much. Take care.